Right, we're going straight on. Without further ado, I really pleased to introduce to you Professor Terry Wrigley from the University of Northumbria, and he's going to start us off with a little bit of Postman Pat.
Yes. You've given it away. Well, we're going to do that in a couple of minutes, actually. Another school is possible. I checked the attendance list before we started. Sorry, I'm not allowed to move anywhere apart from this little space here because of somebody's videoing. I checked the attendance list and noticed that there was sort of a fairly even balance between people working in England and people working in Scotland. And some of the things I'm going to say particularly will focus on the English experience. I make no apologies for doing that. It's very important that Scots know some things that are happening there, because for the last 20 years it's been a kind of international epicenter of reaction in school policy in particular. So I'll try to signal up if I'm talking particularly about England, though most of what I'm going to say I think is relevant to everybody. And since we're at the Storytelling Centre, maybe we start by thinking a bit about narratives. There's been so much academic effort gone over the years, rather fashionably, into denying the importance of grand narratives and the deconstruction of binaries. Meanwhile, those who own and control the world we live in have relentlessly pursued a project of strengthening their own power in the enduring binary between capital and labour through a project known as Neoliberalism. I think we can best understand that word as an attempt to purify capitalism by returning to its mythical golden age. So you keep trying to mention story. The energy of the core plot, if you like, is to increase profit by destroying trade unions, shrinking the welfare state, privatising hospitals and schools, and so on. Of course, they've just had one of their big storytelling events, the Tall Story event they've been running in Manchester over the last couple of days. I'm surprised they don't choke on their own rhetoric. The neoliberal master narrative has also invoked the end of history, an assertion that conflict based on class interests and imperial power has disappeared, to be replaced by a straightforward search for greater efficiency, requiring a cult of management. They prefer the word leadership, actually, but they mean management. It sounds more glamorous, leadership. Meanwhile, of course, part of the global ruling class have been acting out a rather large subplot known as the New American Century, of which Syria is now suffering from the aftermath, while another little gang have been telling a fairy story, or is it horror story, called Fundamental British Values. I wouldn't want to suggest that the banking crisis of 2008 was part of anybody's narrative design. In fact, the world's greatest economists seem to have entirely failed to predict it. But the rapidity with which the mega-rich turned it to their own advantage by preaching the inevitability of austerity politics is an astounding virtuoso improvisation. Behind the scenes, these people managed to double their wealth in 5 years, according to the Sunday Times, no less. The real story is dispossession, not a shortage of resources. The crises we are living in the world are quite elemental and overlapping. And as with all great epics, the royal storytellers create an impression of inevitability. In Thatcher's words, there is no alternative. As Roberto Unger explains, and thank you Michael Fielding for giving me this one, they're spinning the illusion of a dictatorship of no alternatives, combining Adam Smith's invisible hand of a market with a particular interpretation of globalization. A new fatalism is being spun to make resistance seem pointless. Sorry, by the way, you no need to take lots of notes because I've got lots of handouts that you can have afterwards. So just relax a little bit. The development we find in education that Patsy Salzberg has called GERM, the Global Education Reform Movement, is not free-floating. It connects into this wider story. It's partly about privatisation, education's an additional source of profit. It's very seriously about narrowing down educational aims, so that the only thing that matters is providing service to the economy, the production of an efficient and malleable workforce. In Tony Blair's words, education is our best economic policy. Well, I sense that the story's getting a little bit heavy, so time for Postman Pat. I think you'll see the relevance of this. Of course, Postman Pat is, you must all
Just give me a moment, Jess. I'll be right back. Mr. Carbuncle? Are you here, Mr. Carbuncle?
Clifton, you're late.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I was helping my son with his football practice.
This is not a moment to be late for, Clifton. This is the start of a bold new era for the special delivery service.
Nice to see you, Pat. Hello, Pat. Bot. Are you sure this is a good idea, Mr. Carbuncle? He might need someone to help him on his round.
I have thought of that. Adorable, isn't he?
Oh, yes, it's very adorable. Patbot, do you know what to do?
The Patbot 3000 is fully programmed in all SDS procedures and protocols. I designed his matrix myself.
Oh, I see. Well then, good luck. And remember, the most important thing for a postman is speed, efficiency, ruling the world. Well, I was going to say being friendly, you know, the human touch. You are programmed for that, aren't you?
Of course. Patbot, show Clifton how friendly you can be.
That's a lot of teeth, but not exactly...
Time to kick the babies out of the nest, Clifton.
Oh, well then, let me know if I can be of any help. Patbot. Good morning, Ben. I am Postman Pat. I am here to deliver the post because I am Postman Pat, the postman.
You feeling all right there, Mucker?
The special delivery always gets through. Do not be suspicious. This is just the cat. Because I am Postman Pat. Okay, let me open the door, Ben, because I am friendly and also nice, and in no way part of a plot to take over the SDS corporate executive.
Been working out, Pat?
No time to chat. We've got a special delivery. Get ready for takeoff. Goodbye, lovely day.
Okay. Have a good day, Pat.
Everything is shipshape. Hello, I am Postman Pat. Just the cat. I forgot my post bag. Please get it for me. This is not a trick to get you out of the van, Just the cat. We've got a special delivery. To deliver anything. Anywhere. My van. Does he have insurance?
Better. He's under warranty.
Rise and shine. Well done. I would not be promoted. I am Postman Pat. The special delivery always gets through. Mission accomplished. These roads are inefficient. Come on, Jess. Time to go.
Hurry, hurry! We don't want to be late for Pat's big interview. London, James, and don't spare the horses.
Hello? Anyone? What will help?
The mission to deliver anything, anytime. Hey! What's wrong with Pat? The special delivery always gets through. I am not evil, I am only misunderstood. Stop in the name of the law. I will not be a multi.
That's not my pet at all.
Efficiency, morning, Mrs. Doggins. I am Postman Pat.
Pat, the Reverend and I were just saying how much we enjoyed your singing last night. I had an uncle who had voices as
The special delivery always gets through. I will work it. Mission accomplished.
Sorry, stop it. It has stopped. Has it stopped? Okay, right. I know, let's not have the nonsense of me talking. Yes. Well, would anybody like to just for a couple of minutes suggest some of the things they read in there?
The impact of robots on the workforce.
You go on. Sorry, yes.
Lack of care.
Lack of communication.
I just love that episode. There's so much in those 2 minutes. Yeah. Couldn't write a better script. I mean, maybe even that last point might be one of the most important. And every time I watch it, I see something more. There's like this scripting of the, that goes on. He's learnt the postman pat script in lieu of reality. Right, I'll speed up now. We've had the fun. Yeah, some very powerful metaphors there. And many of you will remember how the verb deliver arrived around 1990 with the national curriculum in England. Curriculum was something pre-packaged and teaching became a matter of delivering this curriculum. So delivery rather than relationship activity. The project of realigning education towards economic aims is being pursued along business principles through new forms of Taylorism, what I've called bullying by numbers, along with the transfer of management styles from private to public sector. Even young children are viewed as potential human capital, as nurseries are increasingly schoolified, and this places stark choices before us, and a need to think deeply about the kind of futures we want. I do find it somewhat ironic, incidentally, that the word leadership is applied to processes which entirely fail to reflect on which direction education needs to move in. Now, neoliberal school reform has entailed its new paradigms of evaluation and change, known as school effectiveness and improvement, which emphasise the difference between schools, relative advantage, competition, in other words, market position. And the role of numbers in school evaluation is particularly significant. Statistical representation provides a very powerful kind of mapping. And of course, a map has to be selective or it would be useless. It would be as big as the world. And that's another story some of you might recognise. But mapping always involves some kind of reduction. But there are different projections and different selections from reality. So rather than simply complaining of reductionism, we need to raise more specific questions about what is being privileged and what's being obscured by the choice of numbers to tell a story, and within that, by the criteria and data selection. Radhika Gurur in Australia, Mary Hamilton in England, and many others have also been making the important point that measurement can create the world it purports to measure. Drawing on a wonderful book called Seeing Like a State. You must all read it, it's wide-ranging. They use the example of how Prussia's forests were standardised following attempts to calculate potential timber supplies as national wealth. This led to increased, you see it before and after, left and right. The change, the replanting, led to increased productivity temporarily at the cost of soil damage, a phenomenal loss of biodiversity, and the loss of resources used in common by local people. Now, there are parallels here with some of the things that have been happening in education, the disappearance, the obscuring of relationships and diversity within regimes of high-stake accountability. Even when the ostensible aim is social justice, particular types of numerical representation obscure more than they reveal. The statistical category of pupil premium child, and that's an English term, became reality overnight. The word was made flesh. In England, you not only see photo displays of the children on free meals, basically, on staff room walls, but stories are now coming through of schools that are teaching these children separately so that you can keep a sharper eye and narrow the gap. This creates a massive distortion, of course, because There's, first of all, many children growing up in poverty are not getting free meals. And secondly, many economically disadvantaged pupils are not culturally or educationally disadvantaged. We have to be aware of this kind of deficit stereotype. At worst, in a context of massive and growing inequality and diminishing opportunity, gap talk serves to scapegoat families and teachers. At best, to use Nancy Fraser's terms, it demands that teachers bring about redistribution, but without engaging in pedagogies that recognise young people's life worlds or facilitate their participation. I have to keep an eye on what the slides are doing just in case we end up somewhere else. Now, more than this, the statistical lens creates illusions that the gap can be closed managerially, an error which is already visible here in Scotland. Questions of history and place and diversity and culture and feelings, let alone curriculum and pedagogy, fade from view. When writing Living on the Edge with John Smythe, I read various ethnographies, and there are too few of them, of post-Thatcher Britain. And it became apparent that the psychological impact of poverty centres around two feelings, which we called shame and futility. Now, these are absolutely central. I'll just plug the book, it's on sale at discount price down below. But shame and futility. Shame is about damaged present identity, made worse, of course, by abuse from conservative politicians and media. Futility undermines future aspirations. And it occurs, for example, when people do training schemes that don't lead anywhere, or when people save up for a little holiday for the kids, but then it all gets swallowed up with the gas bill arriving. Now, schools, I would argue, can either reinforce, we'll skip those extracts, but there's just a couple of examples. You'll find them on your slides anyway. Yeah, schools can either strengthen or counter those two feelings. And I suspect that traditionally schooling has tended to reinforce a sense of shame and futility in many children, and continues to do so. By contrast, the successful inner city schools I studied from my first book, The Power to Learn, had worked out how to enact empowerment in all the major message systems of school life. Questions of school ethos and relationship are important. School in Mallow, so from here. A school in the East End of London. A school in Leicester. But I'll stick with that for a second. There are also things in the structure and culture of schools that don't even get noticed. You know, they become so routine. Things such as dividing children into ability groups in the first month or so in primary school. In Scotland and in England, very, very widespread, with the notion that you sort of know this child's ability, and where does that come from? And of course, all of that is being reinforced by the new testing of 4-year-olds in England, with spurious claims of predictive validity. Just thinking a bit pedagogically now as well, though. I've seen a lot of dedicated, there's this dominance of the exam, and exams are crucially important if you're living on the wrong side of the tracks, or if you've got the wrong skin colour. But I've seen dedicated teachers struggling to persuade 12-year-olds in deprived neighbourhoods that if only they'll work a bit harder, they'll get to university in the end. I don't believe it's at all useful in overcoming a prevailing sense of futility in an area blighted by poverty. To the children, it must seem a bit of a fairy tale, pie in the sky. I think that the issue of connecting children to universities is a much more complex and long and experiential process than that. So if we begin to think pedagogically, in ways that the gap discourse with its managerial means and its statistical comparisons can't do. My first thought is that a lot of school learning amounts to alienated labour, rather like a factory production line. You're told what to do, how long to do it for, move on, and then you get in exchange value, rather than the use of your activity, of your work to share, you get a mark or a grade. Paper rounds pay better. There are alternatives. It's possible to engage young people in considering what to learn and how to learn, and to create a different sense of exchange around the activity, so that learning leads to sharing a product, a performance or a presentation. In other words, authentic learning, not alienated learning. And I will do another plug here, because a couple of years ago with Pat Thompson and Bob Lingard, we put together about 15 case studies from around the world called Changing Schools, which I would commend. I mean, they're very fine stories of education and true leadership. I'd like to, unless we think about a relationship between poverty and education, sociologically and pedagogically, we'll get nowhere. In fact, we'll be stuck with what has been called pedagogies of poverty, which involve a reliance on dull routines, decontextualised exercises, closed questions, drilling in basic skills, and to memorise core knowledge, to use the American term. Indeed, the accountability machine tends to reinforce such practices. I'd just like to quickly show you a few photos, just from some of the schools I've looked at over the years, and we can learn enormously from international and more local examples. Let's see. You know, a couple of pictures of a school I absolutely adore called the Laboratory School in Bielefeld. It's a bit like Mecca, everybody should visit it once in a lifetime. It's the laboratory that's in its 4th decade and wonderful. It's, the homeliness of a Norwegian classroom just amazes me. As well as the love of the outdoors, you know, every school having its own forest school, and kids going there very frequently. Examples in England of schools really asking children to think creatively, think critically. Of course, the religious texts don't say anything about species disappearing and population increase and so on. So the pupils had to really rethink this. We don't have time to go through all of that, but sometimes this happens on a big scale. You know, there's a school which was an incredibly marginalised population in Saragossa, where they redesigned the curriculum so that each month it led towards a big public event, whether a civic event or in the school. So really crucially important. Finally, two from Bradford, where literacy is rooted in a sense of place, diversity and activity. The story behind this is that somebody in central government said all 7-year-olds in November must learn the language of instruction. They must learn this genre. It's November, I am Postman Pat. All will be delivered. And so these teachers said, how the hell can we do this with, you know, early English learners? And so they baked a cake. And they started with the activity, and the genre, the literary genre then came out of that. Now, some while ago, I coined a term, open architectures, to group together teaching methods which have a structure in order to maintain a learning community, a community of common concern. But there's a structure with spaces for individuals and small groups to exercise voice, agency, initiative. And this is what I think the list my own thoughts started off with project method and storyline. but I think it's a much wider list than that. And if anybody wants to join me in writing this book, then the welcome's out there. Or maybe it's a website. I think the crucial things about a lot of these is this combination of structure and openness, the meaningful outcomes, key skills developed within a meaningful context, a community of common concern, ethical, affective and cognitive linked together, and encouraging learners to think of alternative futures and recognition, engagement and satisfaction for disadvantaged learners. Now, I just want to include a couple of brief examples of this because I know I'm going to be pushed for the timing. But project method, as I first discovered it operating in Denmark in social studies, very interesting advice to the teachers incidentally. Don't plan your year in advance, it stops the pupils bringing up their issues for you to deal with. So you start off with a theme and get people hooked into that theme. Then you discuss emerging issues and how you can draw on academic learning to help you study this. And then you divide into groups, and then the groups present to the wider class. And just, I had some, I used to try this with students, and we began with a simulation of they become refugees. The army, the tanks were rolling down the high street just outside here, and it wasn't the Edinburgh tattoo. So it was a very interesting start to that activity. But then I came across, I had to go to Norway to find it actually, something that was being called the Scottish method, which turned out to be storyline. Now the storyline has a sort of spine of narrative, and the teacher just prompts. The pupils form characters for themselves, and the teacher gives prompts for each new stage. And one of my students wrote this one. I think actually we could have a storyline about fracking just at the moment. That would make a very good storyline. Okay, you've had enough chance to glance at that one. Yeah. And then somebody designed another one, a design challenge based on this mock BBC web page. But you see, I think all of these, they tend to they tend to connect up sort of narrative involvement with standing back and thinking and commenting, and I think it's a very powerful thing. Finally, resources of resistance. What can we do to break this dictatorship of no alternatives in education? I think we have to strengthen our action in various ways. We have to get better at talking back to the data, and one particular project I've been involved in, Reclaiming Schools, we've got some flyers about that incidentally, I'll make sure you don't go away without one. But we've been dealing with all sorts of issues, but we're including talking back to the data, seeing the basic flaws, assumptions such as evenly calibrated linear progression in learning. Secondly, it's about building a community of resistance strong enough to challenge the dominant common sense. Thirdly, to prevent the isolation of schools that are daring to be different. I think that's crucially important. And that's maybe the project, that this seminar series is involved in. It's all too easy to succumb to the hegemony of performativity. And enormous ideological efforts were made by the right around the 1970s and 80s to expose progressivism, literally expose it, place it outside, outlaw, marginalise, delegitimise. So it's not surprising if we sometimes think of ourselves, progressive educators, as rather eccentric. A more balanced historical perspective would recognise that schooling has involved two different traditions of equal longevity. And one of them, well, I'll just a little quote. I came across this in the biography of John Keats, and this is where I want to finish. It was describing the school that John Keats attended, which was a dissenting academy set up by John Ryland. One autumn morning, John Ryland called up the whole school to see the departure of the swallows, which had clustered in surprising numbers on the roof of the building. And then it tells the story. Ryland, who believed in educating his pupils by recreation, would demonstrate the movement of planets and moons in the solar system in the playground, and each pupil was given a card describing this star or planet, and they all walked out around to form a giant solar system. The living orrery was set in motion. Now this progressive tradition of experiential, situated and critical learning can be traced back an enormous way. And here I think just some of the names in that story, and a lot of missing history there. And I think that's, some of us have lived long enough to enjoy direct experience by people like Lawrence Stenhouse, Harold Rosen, Douglas Barnes and so on. Not to mention, R.F. Mackenzie, time we got those books reprinted actually. Yeah. So we're living in difficult times, but it's up to us to keep a torch alight, practically as well as symbolically. Thank you.
Well, I didn't expect Postman Pat, so thank you, Terry. I hope we can all agree that was a good start to our afternoon. It's at least got us thinking about what some of the issues and challenges might be.